We're going to be talking about UTM and mostly in the U.S. So, Liz, over to you.
Hi, everyone. As Dawn said, I am the Policy Director for the Commercial Drone Alliance, which is the leading advocacy organization for the commercial drone space in the United States. So I'm going to give the panel each, I'm going to go down the row. If you give quick, 20-second introduction of yourself. Start with Mary Caitlin.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mary Caitlin Ray. I'm a senior counsel at Crowell and Mooring in Washington, D.C. I'm in our transportation group where I focus mainly on aviation issues, lots of drone issues, but we have a really industry-based practice where we focus on general aviation, business aviation, airline issues, regulatory aircraft transactions, and of course emerging technologies like drones and electric aircraft. Prior to joining Crowell, I was in the FAA's Office of the Chief Counsel for about 5 years, where I supported the Next Gen and UAS program offices. And probably most proud moment of my FAA career was helping to launch the UAS IPP, which became the Beyond program and really sort of brought me into this wonderful industry. So happy to be here. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Ben Berlin. I'm an aviation regulatory counsel with Zipline, the world's largest autonomous drone delivery company, and we've made more than 1.5 million deliveries to date and are expanding quickly in the U.S. Looking forward to getting you all a package sometime in the near future.
Hey, everybody. Great to see so many friends here. I'm Jennifer Richter. I am a partner at Akin Gump in Washington, D.C. I lead our telecom media and technology practice, which includes our advanced aviation, emerging technologies, business and group. I think Liz and I started working together on the remote ID ARC many years ago. We represent clients all across the sector, but my particular area of focus is how do we communicate with these flying robots? How do they communicate with each other? How do they communicate with crewed aviation? So lots of issues to resolve there, and looking forward to talking with you about it.
Hi, everybody. I'm MC Chruscicki. I'm co-founder and CTO of AX Enterprise. We're a company that was stood up in 2011 and have been immersed in UAS technology development, including counter UAS, UTM, remote ID, detect and avoid technologies. And the way we got involved in all these crazy activities is we are also the operators of the New York UAS test site. So looking forward to sharing our experiences at New York.
All right, I guess I'm last. So Jessica Brightman with the FAA. I lead our efforts on BVLOS rulemaking and the implementation of UTM. My background is traditional aviation. I'm a former military and Part 121 pilot.
Okay. So I presume that most of you are here because you are excited about drones or you are interested in their next steps. We've got a whole conference program that's going to talk about, I'm sure, all of the incredible benefits of drones. So I'm not going to go into a lot of specifics about all of the amazing safety and economic and, life-saving benefits that drones can bring. We're really here and we have a really amazing panel to talk about kind of why we don't have and where we're not seeing necessarily all of those benefits and where we are in terms of progress to getting there. So I'm not going to talk a lot. I'm going to let them do the talking. And we're going to start with Mary Caitlin. So this is Law Tech Connect. I presume words matter, and several of you are attorneys on stage. So let's start with clearly defining the challenge. I think beyond visual line of sight is a really critical element of the UAS traffic management element. You don't necessarily, I think, need a lot of traffic management if you don't have beyond visual line of sight. So let's start with BVLOS, which is generally how we pronounce beyond visual line of sight. It's what makes BVLOS such a challenging concept in the existing regulatory framework?
So that's a really, really great starting point, I think, for everything else that we're going to talk about on this panel. And I would say the short answer to that very complex question is that it is a combination of safety, technological, and regulatory concerns and sort of holes across the space. The core challenges in no particular order except for the first one, which I think is probably the biggest hurdle, and that's safety and airspace integration. I think all the other challenges kind of flow from this prime challenge. And I think the biggest risk here is the risk of midair collision, right? That's what everyone's, trying to prevent. That's, the purpose of air traffic control is to maintain, safe separation of aircraft. So when you have drones that are flying beyond visual line of sight, by definition, they can't rely on the operator's line of sight to avoid other aircraft. And this is connected to the regulatory requirement under Part 91, 113 that requires that pilots be able to see and avoid other aircraft. So because there's no standardized, universally acceptable detect and avoid system that can automatically prevent collisions and meet that see and avoid requirement that stems from the regulation, the reality of what BV loss is and needs to be is at odds with the current language that we have in the regulation. And Liz, to your point, that's why words matter. So one of the recommendations of the BV loss ARC, which I know we'll talk about more on this panel, was that the FAA modify that see and avoid requirement to sort of make room for a technologically based solution, without the industry sort of having to jump through a lot of hoops to meet that requirement. So I think a lot of folks are hopeful that we'll see some type of solution to that in the Part 108 NPRM, which, as everyone has heard today, we're hoping is going to be imminently released. So that's, what I would say is sort of the first overarching concern or hole that we're solving for. The second is, there are some gaps remaining in technology. I think this sort of is secondary to the regulatory and safety concerns. But I think that this issue is more sort of in the communications link space, which I know Jennifer is going to talk to us about a lot. This is really important because BV loss relies heavily on strong, uninterrupted communication links, and any loss of signal can result in a loss of control, which is obviously a huge safety issue. And then, regulations, gaps in regulations, which is, related to the safety issue and the 91, 113 requirement to see and avoid. But the lack of standardization in airworthiness and operations certification frameworks, again, creates a lot of hurdles for the industry. Again, we're hoping to see some solutions there in the Part 108 NPRM. And then finally, I think a major concern is still surveillance and traffic management, and that's UTM, which I know we're also going to talk about a lot on this panel. But the lack of real-time awareness. And without UTM, there's a question of how drones are able to maintain real-time situational awareness, which also goes to separation of aircraft and ultimately to safety. So all kind of related issues wrapped up in one big question mark right now, I think.
I think you just did an excellent job of introducing the rest of the conversation. So I think those of us who have been in this space for a long time, and hopefully those of you, if you're new, you're getting a flick really, really quickly that the aviation regulatory framework is very much geared towards crewed aviation with a pilot on board the aircraft looking out of the cockpit window for other air traffic and avoiding it. It probably can't be overstated how much drones, particularly smaller drones, are very much a square peg trying to be fit into the round hole that is the existing aviation framework. So Ben, Mary Caitlin sort of previewed this, but the FAA established a Beyond Visual Line of Sight Aviation Rulemaking Committee back in 2021, which provided some recommendations for how to update the regulatory framework to be performance-based and support scalable BV loss operations. Zipline had a leadership role in that ARC. So can you talk about some of the key recommendations that the ARC made that are necessary to right-size the rules and sort of unlock this space?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Liz. But first, I wanted to run an experiment. If you participated in the ARC, could you raise your hand? There we go. Yeah, thank you very much. So first, it was a huge effort by a lot of people. The number of stakeholders involved and the timeline they finished the report truly stunning. And I think it speaks volumes to the amount of content FAA appears to have taken from the ARC report and put into the Part 108, at least based on the listening sessions I've been to. A lot of the framework that we're probably going to see comes from that ARC report. So thank you all to those who participated in that. And Mary Caitlin did a great job. All the gaps are the things that the ARC report really kind of suggested solutions to. And so one of those was setting a baseline level of safety that operations had to meet regardless of use case or size of the drone. And so the FAA would have a tool to be able to determine whether or not there were either airworthiness qualifications or mitigations or operational mitigations you could put in place to make these things be done safely. So it's a great place to start on how you can design a drone and an operation to be done safely. Perhaps the most controversial was a change in the right-of-way rules. And so the ARC suggested giving drones the right-of-way over crewed aircraft and or non-cooperative crewed aircraft and low-altitude airspace. And
Can you define your term,
yes,
cooperative?
Your words are important. So if you are a crewed aircraft and you have ADS-B out transmitter and you are pinging your location to other aircraft in the airspace, you're called cooperative. And so other aircraft can detect you and can avoid you more easily. And so if you don't have that equipment installed, you're non-cooperative. And so it's pretty easy to avoid aircraft that are cooperative because it's the sensors to pick up those signals and to avoid those are fairly, they're easy to install, and the software you need to create flight routes around those is pretty easy, relatively. But the real challenge is how do you see or detect aircraft that are not sending those signals out? So giving drones the ability to essentially have the right of way in low-altitude airspace is a huge change in how the FAA envisions the airspace. And so if you've read the report, you know some people abstained, some didn't vote because some of the issues around the right of way issues. And I'd say I've been talking for a while, so I'll wrap this up. I think maybe the next biggest one is the risk-based approach to airworthiness qualification. So not every drone needs to have triple redundant systems and parachutes, and if it's a lightweight drone doing a low risk operation, perhaps you don't need as much. So
it's a great transition to Jess. So Jess hinted in her bio, her office is in charge of both the rulemaking and some UTM implementation, which makes her the perfect FAA representative on this panel. So Jess, obviously the rule has been underway for a number of years now. We all saw the very exciting news that it has moved to the next stage of the process. It's at the White House under interagency review. So can you talk a little bit about some of the objectives, the principles, the overarching principles the FAA had in writing this rule, and what are you hoping to achieve?
Definitely. I think Ben set a good foundation as well. We worked from the BVLOS ARC report, and we are creating a regulation that is performance-based, that creates a regulatory framework for BVLOS operations, as well as a regulatory framework to approve UTM or automated data services. Our goal in this regulation is to right-size regulatory burden with the risk of the operation. Like Ben said, not every aircraft needs to have multiple redundancies. It depends on the operation. It depends on the size of the aircraft. It depends on a variety of things. So we are looking at having varied levels of requirements for both operators and aircraft based on the type of operation, the scale of the operation. And then we are also looking at allowing or varying the requirements for UTM and other types of services such as detect and avoid based on the location of the operation and the ground risk related with that operation, or the air risk, what type of airspace you're operating in. So the overall goal is to create a system that is performance-based, that will evolve over time, and you can use industry consensus standards to meet our requirements, and the level of the bar that you have to meet will be dependent on the risk of your operation.
Great. And Jennifer, the FAA isn't the only one undertaking some rulemaking. The FCC has got some exciting things going on as well. Can can you share some updates? Talk about how these, how the FCC's work is going to support ultimately the BVLOS efforts that are underway industry-wide?
Yes, I can. And I'm going to try to be upbeat about this, although I wrote a very cranky article in Women in Drones about the state of spectrum regulation for UAS. So if you really want the real answer to all this, you should read that article. There are a couple of things that are happening at the FCC, and that's good. The 5030 to 5091 spectrum, which was allocated for UAS command and control 10 years ago, I think, finally has a rulemaking, and access to that spectrum is allowed on a temporary basis, but it's just a small chunk of it. It's not a networked solution, so it's not really a UTM solution, so it's not really a BVLOS solution, but there is that spectrum. It's available. We're working with some companies on how they can get access to it before we have some real rules for the band. NTIA and the FCC and the FAA are engaged in a study related to the spectrum. It's going to be a little bit before it's really available to you. But there is another rulemaking the FCC is looking at with respect to advanced air mobility. They're looking at spectrum in the 450 megahertz band and the 24 gigahertz band. Aura is operating at 450, and Matrix Space and Echodyne are operating at 24. Really interesting that the FCC is bringing that to the fore. Again, I imagine it's going to be some time before they resolve that one. But another rulemaking that you can get involved in if spectrum issues are of interest to you. I want to say, if you are a service provider, you're doing drone services, drone delivery, or you're manufacturing or inventing technology in this space, you need to be concerned about the spectrum issues. It has been such a long time. It's been, I think, 12 years since the 5030 to 5091 was recommended for allocation by the World Radio Conference. It's been 10 years since the allocation was actually made in this country for that band. So imagine that. Here we are 10, 12 years later, and we still don't have good rules for the ability to use this spectrum to support UAS and AAM. It's going to take a while. Separately, interestingly, we had a meeting with the FAA last week for a client, and I asked, so, hey, what's happening with spectrum from your perspective? And their view was pretty flexible, which is progress in part. They said, really what we're looking for when people come in with a concept of operations or they're trying to get certification of a vehicle is that they're using licensed spectrum. In other words, it could be potentially commercial wireless spectrum, it could be satellite spectrum, and I think we all think that is going to ultimately be part of the solution here, not just these aviation bands, because it's just not enough spectrum for all the vehicles that'll be flying. I thought that answer was really interesting because the FCC is not there yet, right? So the FAA is actually more progressive on these spectrum issues than the FCC.
Make note, Jess. Just take that back to the FAA. You're winning something.
This is fascinating, right?
I'll take any kudos.
Yeah. So in the FCC's last pronouncement on this a few years ago with respect to their 374 report to Congress, they said, we understand everybody wants to use the commercial wireless and satellite bands for UAS, but we're just not there yet. There could be interference issues we've got to resolve. We might need a rulemaking. We don't know. So just know that if you're out there using the commercial wireless bands, you're using LTE 5G, that's not approved in the United States for use. So really complicated. Happy to talk with you if you have questions around this. And I imagine this is something we're all going to have to focus on as we move ahead if we want to really make progress.
Yeah. We had the special assistant to the FCC chairman at an event last week. He seems pretty energized. So I think we may have some passion at the leadership level. I'm hoping that can translate into progress.
I agree with that. Actually, I'm hearing more coming out of the FCC than I have in previous administrations about focus on UAS and trying to get people energized in multiple bureaus about it and working on it. So it's good.
Yeah, Jess?
Can I just say, you said words matter before, and there's one thing I want to say is there's been a lot of talk about UTM systems.
Yeah.
And we're not at FAA, we're not looking at it as a system. We're looking at it as an ecosystem. And the big difference is that UTM, from our perspective, is an ecosystem of services that each service mitigates a risk for a drone for a safety risk in a drone operation. And each drone operation is going to need a different combination of services. So I want to move away from thinking of it as a standalone system the way we do ATM systems.
So I was just going to, thank you, Jess, transition to UTM. So I do think, and Jess's point is really critical here. There's a lot of misunderstanding about UAS traffic management. So I do just want to level set before we get into a conversation about UTM, about what Jess just gave a great, what UTM is not. I think there's a lot of people who think that UTM is a box that you're going to be able to buy off the shelf and turn on. And that's really not what the concept is about. It's been around for over a decade now. In a sentence, I've managed to work all of the buzzwords into one sentence. You're going to be really proud of me. Here we go. Focuses on establishing a federated set of services to safely manage high volumes of highly automated drones operating cooperatively in low-altitude airspace. Did you get all of them? So, shout out to NASA, who obviously originated this concept more than a decade ago now. And they laid a lot of groundwork, but I think we're all very excited to move from concept to reality here. So MC, can you sort of bridge that gap for us? Your company provides, obviously, UTM services in New York. Tie BVLOS to UTM for us. What makes UTM services critical to BVLOS flight?
Before I jump into that, I really want to talk about this COM issue. I will tell you, because I said we are operating the New York UAS test site, there are so many customers that are coming in with multimodal COM capabilities. Now, obviously, that adds weight and power to these UASs, but clearly the market, whether it's commercial or government, are very, very concerned. And we're seeing a lot of mix of LTE, Starlink, tactical links, and they're putting all of this capability on a drone. And it's getting very interesting. So I think we really need to raise the flag on that one, because so anyhow, that's my commercial break on COM. UTM, it keeps evolving, right? There's lots of capabilities, lots of services, whether you're talking the USS, the UAS service supplier, which is kind of the heart and soul of your UTM capability. And then you have your SDSPs, which is your supplemental data service providers. So if you think about your environment and you have a number of sensors, you're going to have a way of ingesting that sensor information that could theoretically be an SDSP service for you. So what we have found, UTM and all these services are evolving. We don't even have standards for SDSPs to speak of, really. They're couple, right? We're getting there. Yes, it's work in progress. But I guess I should have asked before I jumped into this, how many operators are out there trying to kind of scratch the itch of maybe an infrastructure support, medical support? Are you guys, any of you guys operators out there?
Couple.
Okay. All right. So, I didn't expect that. anyhow, all right, let me say this. Again, because we are operating the New York UAS test site, we have a number of folks that want to come in and test their platforms, test their technology. And while UTM services are evolving, they are great as we speak right now. They allow strategic deconfliction so that you can have safe separation in the airspace. You have air domain awareness based on these SDSP capabilities. You have remote ID. There are beginnings of detect and avoid. So what does all that mean? What's the so what? Well, real life examples. We are supporting at one time 5 tests that involve large and small drones with general aviation that may be serving as intruders against a detect and avoid capability. And because we're at a towered airport, we also have things like Apache helicopters in the pattern. We have C-17s in the pattern. So part of our safety case is to use UTM services to set up the plan of the day and give the safety briefing to everyone and show where the different volumes of flights are going to be, where the manned aircraft are going to be, whether they are cooperative or uncooperative, and where the drones are going to fly the different elevations. And I will tell you, at New York, we've taken UTM beyond 400 feet, right? Because we are dealing with large and small. There's no real restriction. And the tools are invaluable for enabling us to get the job done. And in my opinion, we are pushing what the future NASA is going to look like in New York. And it's allowing not only the companies to test their technology in a very efficient way, but we're testing and assessing the tools on a regular basis. We welcome companies to bring in their own software tools. We plug it into our framework, and that way we can evolve the ecosystem. So, come to New York.
I was going to say that ecosystem is really so it's great because I think the FAA evolves from starting something great in Dallas to now evolving into a full operational evaluation for UTM. Jess, can you talk about that evolution and where you're at now with that?
Yeah, this started about little over 2.5 years ago at one of the drone symposiums or at I believe a app that follow on from one of the UFTs, where industry came to the FAA and said they wanted to do a more real world live test of UTM or live implementation of UTM. So we started working with a variety of different groups, including some of the people on stage here, and got to the point where we were able to stand up and start utilizing UTM strategic deconfliction services in the airspace for live operations. We began in North Texas, which people have heard of from the Dallas implementation. But one thing that's important to note is that that project is not limited to North Texas. And currently through that project, we now have UTM services operating and supporting live BVLOS operations across the country in North Texas, in Utah, in Arkansas, in New York State, in North Carolina, and some other states to begin to add soon. And it's utilizing the same services and the same, digital infrastructure. We're using the same DSSs or discovery and synchronization services that allow the different USSs to talk to each other and to do the deconfliction. And it's an evolving project. And right now we have strategic deconfliction out there. I know that the industry cohort is currently working on prioritization, and there will be some guidance and that will be available at some point soon for that. And then there is The next step we're going to be working on is conformance monitoring for situational awareness, which is the next service in the ASTM standard. So all of this work is based on the ASTM F3548-21 standard. It's the end of the day. So, after we do conformance monitoring for situational awareness, we'll look at other services within that standard based on the risk needs for where the operations are occurring.
This is very exciting. Ben, I know your company is one of the operators who is participating in this effort. Can you just give from an operator perspective, how does a cooperative UTM ecosystem make a difference to your operations and how you operate?
It makes it possible to have scale drone operations. If I'll give you an example of what was required before we had UTM in place.
Perfect.
And so if there was a NOTAM issued by another drone operator in the same airspace we wanted to fly in, we had to first figure out who that was. It's not always clear. Then we had to call them and we had to deconflict over the phone. And you can imagine that you can't do that hundreds of times a day, if not even 10 times a day. And so being able to rely on UTM services to do that in the span of seconds automatically makes our vision a possibility.
So, Jennifer, I want to bring it back to your point about the spectrum implications here. Obviously, there are spectrum implications. There are network implications, not just spectrum implications. Network is something different. There are network implications. This is a highly cooperative and highly automated, and in particular, I think the places that we're seeing pop up tend to be not, I won't call them rural. They're not, metropolitan areas, but they're not rural. So what, do you have any recommendations for the industry, for the FAA, for policymakers in general to keep in mind as the volume of operations and services starts to increase?
Yeah. So particularly because I think it's going to be a few years before we have actual aviation spectrum that we can use and we can use on a widespread basis. I think we do need to push as an industry and help the regulators to see that we can use safely commercial wireless, commercial satellite, as you're saying, LTE or 5G, Starlink. I think Iridium has a product also. I mean, I think these commercial resources are safe to use, should be tested. The FCC, the FAA industry should be working to understand, are there any real technical issues that need to be resolved, or are the standards bodies going to resolve that for us? But we all really need to be moving ahead in that direction. And I think also to your point, MC, about multimodal, we should be thinking about UTM systems incorporating a dynamic frequency management system function so that it's not just the 5030 to 5091, but it's also LTE, satellite, maybe unlicensed, so that when a UTM operator is trying to, allow any kind of operation to move ahead beyond visual line of sight, maybe it's heavy, maybe it's something that needs video, or maybe it's something that needs sensors, that UTM system can actually determine what is the best spectrum for this function and for this distance. Mm-hmm. And so that it's actually a smart solution and not, I don't think we're there yet as an industry thinking through these issues, but I think that's where we need to get.
Are there interoperability considerations for that too?
I think at the application layer, it's all interoperable, yeah. So I wouldn't be concerned about that piece. But, the vehicles have to be able to tune to whatever spectrum you might want to deploy. Yeah.
So, I think this kind of brings us to one of the, I'm going to zoom us out a little bit, the considerations around man-machine interface and the automation elements of this, and to what degree, the technology can do it for us versus, to what degree we need to make intentional decisions as policymakers or as operators or as service providers So I kind of want to bring us into the automation part of this conversation. Mary Caitlin, kind of again, coming back to the regulations, automation is also a very challenging concept. Automation is not new to aviation. It's a critical part of a lot of the aviation system. At the same time, highly automated systems, there's a difference between a human in the loop versus a human on the loop versus a human out of the loop. So can you put this in sort of the context of the regulations? How do highly automated drone operations kind of strain the existing rule set?
I would say they strain it considerably. That's the short answer. I think the longer answer is that the framework partially supports highly automated operations, sort of on a case by case basis. And once again, we're dealing with some regulatory holes here where the regulations don't quite match up with what technology offerings are out there and what the industry can do. I feel like we say this at Law Tech Connect every year, and specifically on the BVLOS panel every year. But at the risk of sounding like a broken record, I'll say it again. The technology has far outpaced what the regulations are able to keep up with, and that's that's not necessarily a terrible thing. It's a product of our regulatory system, which we're about to see play out.
In fairness to Dawn and this panel, it is said on I think every BVLOS panel at every conference.
Yeah.
Not just Dawn.
No. So and the regulations are still designed with the assumption that there is a human in the loop. And that's where, an operator is monitoring and overseeing, if not directly controlling the operations. So when you have, a highly automated drone, that really challenges existing assumptions about who's responsible. Who's responsible for safety? What happens if something goes wrong? Who is in control? So while the existing regulations assume that a human is overseeing or controlling the aircraft at all times, autonomy and full autonomy is, without a human in the loop, available to intervene. And that's really just not currently supported without exemptions or waivers, and sort of creating like a Swiss cheese, or as you put it earlier, putting a square peg into a round hole. And the other thing that I think is probably less of an FAA regulatory consideration, but is a legal consideration nonetheless, is accountability and liability, right? So when you have a highly automated operation and something goes wrong, who's responsible? Like, who is legally responsible for the damages? Is it the operator? Is it the software provider? Is it the aircraft manufacturer? Like, those questions have yet to be answered, and they're ones that are still really important.
I'm gonna call an audible since you set me up so nicely. Jess, surely that's something the FAA had to grapple with in writing its current rule set. Would you care to comment?
Definitely. And I think it's something that I'm going to start first with some current work that we're doing. As many of you have probably heard of our near-term approvals process. And that's the framework that we're utilizing, the program that we created after the 2018 FAA reauthorization to accept or authorize UTM services in advance of rulemaking. One of the requirements we have in that, as you go through as an NTAP participant, as a service provider, or as an operator and service provider, or as a champion operator, is we need a service level agreement between the operator and the service provider. It can be between different, like Zipline, between different or parts of the organization, or like between MC's company and her champion operators. It's very hard to really document that. And we've learned through the reviews and approvals that we've had, this is something that the industry is still trying to figure out. One thing I would say is that the legal framework that was created through the governance agreement for the UTM operational evaluation, this governance agreement was based on the GUTMA template. That has helped create much more robust and thorough service level agreements that really define where accountability starts and ends, and responsibility starts and ends for everyone. And there will be these requirements and this learning we're incorporating into the rulemaking so that as we go forward, we will know, services, operators, manufacturers, all of that is going to be, we need to know from the FAA who's accountable and responsible because, well, we're a regulatory agency, and when something goes wrong, we must enforce against those regulations. But I think it's also important for what you brought up in the terms of the liability as well. I think it's a dual-based concept, and as we evolve it, we're going to need to make sure that those sort of lines evolve together so that we don't have any disconnects there between the regulatory responsibility and the legal responsibility for liability.
There are so many different threads I could pull. Ben, I'm going to give you the choice of which thread to pull. Your choices are talking about how critical automation is to actually achieving scalability. Alternatively, you could also talk about going through the near-term approval process and how that's supporting your goal of automation and scalable operations. You could also pull the thread of the criticality of GUTMA in all of this. I leave the options up to you. Pull whichever thread you'd like.
I might do a
So
combination.
pick your own adventure.
I appreciate the options, Liz. I'll do a combination of the first two, I think. So
Love it.
working with Jess's group to do an NTAP approval, Zipline not only designs and manufactures and operates its own drones, it designs and operates its own UTM system or ecosystem. Actually, we participate in the ecosystem. And so I think working with the FAA was really straightforward. They have a clear set of requirements. Rarely do you say working with the government was very easy, but in this case, it was very easy. So thank you, Jess. Kudos to you and your team for
Second
making
time in an hour.
making that a
Doing great.
possibility.
Yes.
Yeah, I got to keep getting this approval. So, no, but it's true. I'm being sincere. But automation really, I think, we look at automation in a couple of different levels. One is the aircraft. And so we talked about accountability and liability. Who is programming the aircraft to make its maneuvers, or how does it handle off phenomenals automatically without pilot, intervention? And so we had to make sure the aircraft can respond to those automatically. And then how do we manage our fleet in a way that doesn't require 1 million people to move aircraft around to make sure that they're maintained properly? And then how do we automatically interact with other airspace users? And so those are all levels of automation that have to work flawlessly for us to be safe and efficient and profitable. And so, UTM is just one small piece in how we deal with those different levels of automation.
MC, I'm sure you have thoughts on this as well. You can choose a different adventure if you want.
So kudos to Jess and her team. We are definitely going through the NTAP process to bring a key site to New York that I alluded to. What scares me is the lawyer part of all this. Because, we built a service level agreement between our AX and our operator. Our operator is a great company, Causey Aviation Unmanned. Together, we're going to work with Upstate Medical to deliver healthcare services, whether it be pharmaceuticals, organs, blood, whatnot, throughout New York State. It's very exciting. And I will say automation is key. And dealing, I think what people need to remember is to get someone you can trust, someone you can count on with respect to an operator. Because so many times we've experienced an event because someone programmed the drone incorrectly. So you really need to know who you're dealing with when you create these agreements. And then UTM, that, obviously you want the services in place to support that deconfliction. You want to support conformance monitoring. So as you're flying in the airspace with manned traffic, you can do it safely. So I feel very comfortable With the NTAP process, I think the rigor is there to help us get there safely. And I think automation, well, it may be a little nerve-wracking, this digital world, that's, to me, key, because the human makes more mistakes than the digits do. So we see that all the time, too, where
No doubt.
panic, the pilot panics, and next thing you know, the drone's going in a tree. So I'm pretty excited about NTAP.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the challenges that the FAA has struggled with over the years. Is it's not just the system that relies on the human in the loop and the system that relies on the human on the loop. It's how both of those systems can exist together, which is an unenviable challenge. I do want to pivot us for just a minute over to GUTMA, because they really are doing pioneering work in this space. Ben, could you just touch on what role these types of organizations play in creating a global harmonization and why that global harmonization is critical?
Sure. For those of you who don't know, GUTMA stands for the Global UTM Association. Thank you. But they bring together civil aviation leaders from all over the world to talk about UTM and integration of drones and AAM in the airspace. And they really are a framework which we can use to take what we've learned and successful and export that, and then also import good ideas from other places. And so they have an annual conference called Harmonized Skies, and we meet with, it's an amazing just gathering of leaders from aviation from all over the world. And I think they have given us a framework for data sharing to do UTM in the United States. I think they're going to lead the way in a lot of ways for the future for UTM. So if I could just take a quick pivot. Earlier, we've talked about industry-based standards quite a bit on this panel. And if you know the history of FAA, Part 23 rewrite, Remote ID, 107, Ops for People, like the FAA is moving towards using standards to set safety levels for its operations. And those standards bodies need people to help develop the standards and to improve them. So if you want to make an impact on what the rules are going to say and how they're implemented, and you have the time, like get involved with ASTM. It's a great use of your time.
Yeah, and I was actually going to go there as well, Ben. So thank you for bringing that up. Standards are really important because of these performance-based regulations. But back to GUTMA, that's also, that I would say, participating in both ASTM and GUTMA are really important for both the standards and the international harmonization. The last panel I talked on, I was the only person that took off in an airplane in one jurisdiction and flew to this destination here. Everybody else sitting on stage came from a different country, flew through at least one or two civil aviation jurisdictions seamlessly, and we take that for granted. That didn't happen, by mistake. And we need to be very intentional on the drone side to assure that those types of operations will be plausible in the future, and that the system that is built by a company like Ben's or any others, is deployable here in the United States and in all other countries in the world to allow the industry to really grow. So it's really important that we do both the standards and international harmonization, and neither of those happen just by people like me or by very few people. It's a team sport when it comes to safety, and we need participation from everyone. Off my soapbox.
And I think these two points are not unrelated, right? So the industry consensus work that's happening here in the United States in many ways is driving the global harmonization that we want. And it's just like traditional aviation, the United States wants to set the standard. And so part of the key of participating in the standards work is not only making sure that ultimately the standard supports either your drone or your operational, constraints or how you want to operate, that the standard should be unlocking the ability for you to do that. But it's also around if you grow and you outgrow this country and you want to go to another country, you want that country to also use the same standard that you're already using in this country. So, I mean, I think we're seeing that not only with some of the ASTM standard, but particularly the ASTM standard for UTM is starting to grow an international presence, which I think we're all very excited about. Jess, you look like you are.
Well, I definitely think so, but I think there's also international standards bodies such as Euro-K and others.
Yep.
So I definitely think wherever you're from, participate in the standards and help build this ecosystem.
Yep. All right. We have got a little less than 10 minutes left. So I want to kind of end on which question do I want to ask you to end on? I've got so many. Okay. So let's do this. We're going to go down the line, back and forth. So the first question going down, what, if you give me 1 to 3 milestones that are needed, and you don't get to cop out, no, you can't stay the rules. So 1 to 3 milestones needed to further BVLOS and UTM implementation in the United States. You can pick one, you can pick a few. You want me to start at the other end?
I mean, are we allowed to pick like aspects that would go into a potential rule?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, you can't just say the rule, but you need
Okay.
to, yeah.
Okay, I will say I think that UAS maintenance, a UAS maintenance framework is ultimately going to be really important, and I think it's something that doesn't come up a whole lot, and that hasn't necessarily been scaled. I know it's anticipated to be part of Part 108, but I think that we talk about harmonization. I think that UAS maintenance will go a long way to being able to show that you have an airworthy, safe aircraft. So I would pick that one.
Great choice. I'm surprised, actually. I'm going to say electronic conspicuity. That hasn't been said yet on this panel.
Yes.
I think transparency of the airspace is going to be key.
I think the one thing that could really help in the near term is if ICAO leaned in on approving for use any licensed protected spectrum, not just aviation protected spectrum for this use, and setting forth some standards for that use. I think pressure from the outside and standards from the outside will really help our domestic agencies.
So I'm going to lean on infrastructure. I think in addition to communications, we need the network infrastructure so that as we connect sensors, whether they be FAA or DoD or commercially bought sensors, we're going to need that framework, if you will, so that these drones can fly autonomously and avoid objects and other drones.
Okay, Ben stole my idea. First of all, I think it's a good one. But since that was already brought up, I'm going to go back to standards. The development and maturation of standards to support both UTM services, airworthiness, or 3 things actually, UTM services, airworthiness, and operations.
Is it, Jess, would you agree or disagree with the sentence that the robust standards work will make or break the FAA's upcoming rules?
Definitely. We can do all the work all day long and get a rule out, but if there is not a robust suite of standards to meet the performance requirements in that rule, operations will not be a reality.
And because I don't think there's a lot of people from the FAA, we can say, if you kind of, to I think someone's point about the history of the FAA and performance-based rulemaking, and Part 23 was mentioned. If you ever go look up how long it took from the FAA finalizing Part 23 into a performance-based rule to how long it took the first aircraft to be certified under Part 23, should give you a good idea of how important standards are and how much they matter to successfully implementing a rewrite of a rule. So now we're going to come back down the row, and you get your lightning round for each panelist. In 30 seconds, because Dawn is giving me, all the fingers are now on one hand only. I was getting 2 hands earlier, but it's down to 1 hand. 30 seconds, one thing you want the audience to basically think about when it comes to UTM and BVLOS, and how they can reach you to learn more.
I think that the important thing to remember is that the last 2 years, we've come a long way. But we do have a lot of work left to do. So I would, again, encourage you to participate in standards, encourage you to learn more, and you can get a hold of me at the FAA. You want me to give my Jessica?
It's up to you. They can also go on LinkedIn.
Jessica.a.brightman@faa.gov.
So I would agree with the standards. I'm not a fan of being on the standards committee, but I like to delegate it to other people because I do think it's important.
We all do that. It's not going to happen. Just pointing that out.
I think the FAA's work with NTAP in pushing more key site capabilities out is really going to accelerate where we as a country are in the national airspace, growing that ecosystem. I think that's really important. Leveraging the 7 designated test sites to do some of that heavy lifting maybe, and working with those partners that are involved in key site, I think is another thing that we should think about. And if you want to talk more, I'm at booth 2133, MC Chruscicki. My email is very long. I'll give you a business card when we meet.
Perfect.
Spectrum work for UAS and AAM is far from done. And so it is a long pole in the tent. And I said this at the very first NASA UTM conference. I said, I fear Spectrum is going to be the long pole in the tent. You're going to get all the rest of these really interesting issues solved for aviation, and we are going to be no place on Spectrum certainty. So we all need to lean in on it. And I do think looking at it from an international perspective and a harmonization perspective is what's really going to push this along.
And how can they reach you?
Sorry. Jennifer Richter, Richter like the scale, jrichter@akingump.com.
I think from next steps for BVLOS, it's going to be vehicle-to-vehicle deconfliction. How can we accomplish that with the spectrum we have, and what tools do we have in place now that we can use to make that a possibility? And you can reach me at benjamin.berlin@flyzipline.com. Thank you all.
I would say, everyone in this room who are stakeholders, think about how you can get a seat at the table right now, whether that's through reading and commenting on the, imminent Part 108, or, talking to, local representatives or your legal counsel or, government affairs specialists about, what's going on with air traffic right now. I think that can go, either way for the industry. We hope that it goes a good way. But we're definitely at, an inflection point, I think, in general in our aviation industry. And it's a great time for the drone industry to show that its commitment to safety and to, safe operations. And I can be reached at mray@crowell.com. And you can also reach me through our blog moving forward.
Thank you. So I will just say that I have been in this space for over 10 years now, and I don't think that I've been as optimistic for the future of this industry as I am right now. I do think that we are on, I'll say, more than an inflection point. I think we are on a precipice, and I think we're actually about to cross over into the type of scalability that we've all been seeing on television and Super Bowl commercials, but in the best possible way. So thank you all for being here. I can be reached at Forro@commercialdronalliance.org. And thanks to Dawn for putting this on.